Hi, my name is Jason Page, and I'm the Community Outreach Associate Supervisor for the Turner African American Services Council here at Michigan Medicine. And I have the pleasure to introduce Audrey Lucas, who is our MC for this event today. Audrey, if you'd like to introduce yourself and start the program. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Jason. Good afternoon, everyone. My name again is Audrey Lucas, and the Turner African American Services Council welcomes all of you to our program this afternoon. We are so grateful and honored that you have joined us for our today's presentation. We selected for our 2023 program series the theme Health, Healing, and Happiness. And today we are highlighting the last program in our series, Humor as a Coping Mechanism in African American Culture. Our task mission remains as follows: to serve as a liaison between the community and local health care providers by creating partnerships to increase and enhance access to wellness, health education, and health care, and to diverse, underserved older adults. And our vision, we envision a community in which underserved older adults of color can experience and improve quality of health care and achieve an optimal quality of life. And our present members of TAASC are Faye Askew King, who is our chairperson, and we're hoping that she'll feel better soon. Walter Blackwell, Edna Jackson Gray, Gloria Edwards, Elsie Lewis, Gail Jackson, Audrey Lucas, Joetta Mile, Leo McAvee, Tom Myrie, and of course, Jason, our Community Outreach Associate Supervisor. And we have welcomed two new members to our task group, and they are Dr. Sandra Harris and Mrs. Janice Haynes. Our task members want to join in congratulating Shannon Echeverry, who has been serving as the director of Silver Club Memory Programs since 2018, as she transitions to her new role as a director of Geriatrics Community Programs and the director of the Turner Senior Wellness Program effective November the 1st. And we can now officially welcome her to this role. Our member, Dr. Gloria Edwards, will now give us our program overview, followed by a historical overview by Tom Myrie with a video from Mel Watkins, after which Dr. Edwards will return and introduce our keynote speaker and panelists.
Good afternoon. As a founding member of the Turner African American Services Council, I'm delighted to have you join us for our latest presentation, focusing on issues of interest to seniors of color, and particularly African Americans. Today's topic for discussion is on the historic use of a particular human tool for self-preservation or survival. It is recognized as humor. The experiences of African Americans in this country have been ones of oppression, denial of basic human rights, and servitude. Facing constant expressions of these inhumane treatments is destructive to the human spirit, and yet, through the years, African Americans have found ways of surviving. One of the methods that has evolved through these troubled times has been the use of humor. Poking fun and mocking and ridiculing the oppressor has provided a safer and often subtle outlet for such feelings as rage, impotency, and fear without punishment. Thus, sharing stories among ourselves, not only about each other, but especially about our oppressors' behaviors, reactions, and habits, have brought temporary relief, as well as a way of striking back against intolerable life conditions. We hope that sharing this historical phenomenon of the use of humor and its impact on the lives of African Americans will be enlightening and contribute to greater respect for a people who used a simple human characteristic, such as laughter, to maintain their sanity, their sense of decency and strength. Now, moving forward with our program, I would like to introduce Tom Myrie, who will give us a historical video which describes humor in the African American community.
Thank you, Gloria. Today we're going to take a brief overview of history of humor. A scholar by the name of Mel Watkins has done a lot of work writing books about humor all the way from Africa, slavery, up until the modern day. I will be sharing with you a brief PowerPoint of Mel Watkins, and so let me see if I can share my screen, and we'll get right to it. What you're looking at there is a picture of Mel Watkins. He has written a seminal book called On the Real Side, and he talks about laughter, lying, and signifying. I think most of us who are in the Black experience know what signifying is. And so Mel Watkins has more or less set the stage for us. Mel Watkins was born March 8th, 1940. He worked as a staff writer for the New York Times, and he's written exclusively about the comedy and African American literature. Some of the books that he has either authored or reviewed, one is called Step and Fetch It. The other was Dancing with Strangers, which was a memoir of himself. And the one we'll be talking about briefly today is On the Real Side, Laughing, Lying, and Signifying.
Tom, this is Jason. For some reason, we're not seeing your slides on our end. Would you like me to share the screen? And
okay, let's go back and see if we can share our screen.
all right, and then you'll go to the bottom where it says in the bottom of the bar, historical, your PowerPoint presentation at the way bottom.
Okay.
Continue to go down with your cursor, and it's all the way at the bottom. It's the orange P for your PowerPoint presentation.
You still are not seeing the screen?
Nope, we're seeing launch meeting for Zoom, but you want to go all the way to the bottom with your cursor. Keep going down. Go over to the right now, a little bit more down. Not within the screen, but it's actually the bar at the way bottom. You keep going to the bottom with your cursor.
Yeah, right now, let me come out of. I'm going to stop sharing the screen.
Sounds good. I'll share them for you, Tom. No worries.
Go ahead, if you can do that.
All right. Can you see my slides?
Yes, I see them. I don't know if does anyone else see the slide?
All right, looks good. I'll have you start, Tom, and just let me know. Just say next, and I'll hit next with the slides.
Okay. as I was saying earlier, Mel Watkins has written exclusively about humor, and one of the books he has written is on the real side, and the slide you're looking at now is talking about that. So we go to the next slide. Mel Watkins was born in 1940, so he's an old man right now, and he has written several books, including Step and Fetch It, The Dancing with Strangers, and the one we're talking about here now on the real side. Next. Mel Watkins, I'm going to just do a brief overview of a review of his work in this PowerPoint. And this Arthur Bainton talks about on the real side. He did really an exhaustive history of American humor through the lens of African American sensibilities and African American thinking. Watkins talks about and argues, in fact, that humor has two distinctive strains. One is the mainstream, often appropriated by whites that distorts Black experience, and the other one is an inside humor that it's almost like a private humor. It's hidden from the mainstream. And early on, right after slavery and during slavery, Blacks had a sense of humor, but they didn't really share it directly with the outside. And this issue on the real side is a detail of showing how the interplay between vaudeville, the movies, the radio, television, and up until today, where the humor is no longer hidden, but is out there for everyone to see, including comedians such as Richard Pryor, Bill Cosby, and others. On the real side is a detailed account of how these strains intermingle with these very other issues. Next slide. On the real side concludes with an excellent survey of the recent stand-up comedy and shows how the efforts of Dick Gregory, Red Fox, Flip Wilson, Bill Cosby, and others culminated in the uninhibited humor of Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor is important for Watkins because he tore down the boundaries between the private and public humor. And for those of you who are old enough to remember before Pryor came along, Black humor was not something that was done out in the public so much, particularly in the mainstream. Next. Play the video. Go back and play the video. Jason, could you play the video? Go back. Right at the bottom, you see a link that allows you to play the video. Jason, are you there?
Start with some definition, some way of getting back to the purpose of this whole gathering. And I'm going to start with Mel Watkins and let the other panelists respond after him. You trace the roots of African-American humor back to slavery. Yeah. But when history is taught, we see bondage, we see shackles, we see forced labor, we see savage brutality. Where is the punchline? The punchline is that African slaves, when they were initially brought here, came from a continent where there was an oral tradition, and scandalous talk, criticizing others was a part of that culture. Griots were a very central part of African American or African history of African culture, and griots were essentially early rappers, African rappers. They were like the troubadours from Europe. They went around, they were comic, they commented on the society. They spoke before the kings of various African nations, and they added humor, or they humorously criticized, they humorously did other things. Well, the African slaves who came here brought that oral tradition with them. And so when you get to America and you have them in a bondage situation, you have an entirely different kind of emergence of that humor. Because where in Africa they could speak freely about whatever they wanted to speak about, here they couldn't. That's why in the title of the book, the initial title of this book, which has been changed to A History of African American Humor, but the long title was there before. I spoke about the underground nature of African American humor, because one of the most prominent features or characteristics of African American humor at the outset was that it was underground. It was hidden, because Africans could not say what they wanted. The satirical humor that they brought with them, the satirical, verbal descriptions or commentary on life as they saw it, had to be silenced here. They could not do that. It could mean death. It certainly could mean being sold. It could mean it had very tragic consequences. So the humor was hidden. And what happened was you get folk tales coming out. You get these very interesting folk tales coming out where the humor becomes indirect. It becomes humor that's delivered in a different way. I think one of the main sources of that humor are the old John tales, where the slave pretends to be ignorant, pretends to be naive, but in fact is using his naivete to criticize the master. And later on, I'll read something from that if we have a chance, one of the jokes that illustrate that. But you had the slavery situation, you had the blacks attempting to continue their tradition, their old tradition of criticizing, of observing what was going on here, and you had the pretense of being naive. Then you had minstrelsy come along, whiteface or blackface minstrelsy, that is, white performers performing on stage in blackface and pretending to be black. Again, the pretense went on that the presentation, in the sense that the presentation that was given by these comics was that blacks were ignorant, stupid, unable to deal with life in a serious manner, and they were funny. They were innately funny. They were funny because they were black, and that was the predominant presentation or portrayal of blacks at this point. Blacks then, after slavery, take over minstrelsy themselves. They put on blackface, and here's where we begin to see authentic African-American humor begin to emerge. Because what happens is these performers, people like Billy Curzons and Ernest Hogan and various other performers at the time, later Burt Williams, these people come along and they start to add humanity and some real satire to this humor, which before only portrayed or only presented blacks as being simple-minded, incapable of thinking, and funny because they were stupid. So now you have this gradual change around 1900, and from that you get various other comedians coming out. The humor changes, the public face of the humor begins to change, blackface makeup begins to disappear. You still have a presentation of blacks as being stupid in movies and so forth. You have, in fact, Stepin Fetchit in silent movies was presented as the ignorant black, the slothful, ignorant black. You had various other actors and actresses coming along later. You had Hattie McDaniel, you had Mantan Moreland, you had these comic servants that came along. So you still have blacks being portrayed as submissive, relatively ignorant, and incapable of taking part in real American life. It wasn't until the 1950s that African American humor starts to emerge as we know it now. And you get people like Red Fox, Nipsey Russell, and various others coming along. These people start to deal with the humor that had been hidden all along. That humor was alive in African American communities. It simply hadn't been presented to the American public. With Red Fox, with Nipsey Russell, and with a few others, you start to get this. From them, you get a gradual emergence of the comics that you know now. You get Flip Wilson and Bill Cosby at one point. You get Dick Gregory, who starts to deal with real political humor in 1961. And from that point on, you move up to Richard Pryor, whom I consider the person who opened the door entirely. Because Richard Pryor started to deal with every aspect of that African-American humor that had been hidden previously. And from Richard Pryor, we see what's going on now. You have Dave Chappelle, you have Wanda Sykes, you have some of the people here who can write and perform and honestly present African-American humor. So that's a brief. Beautiful. Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you. That was great. So Jam Donaldson, now how much of what you target in Hot Ghetto Mess in Conversate is Not a Word would you attribute to or think stems in some way from this history of oppression or the way this stuff plays out?
I think it's really interesting to hear it laid out that way, because when you speak about this sort of humor that was underground, I think we still have that in our communities. I think there are still topics that we feel very comfortable talking about in the beauty salon or in the barber shop or at happy hour with our friends, and we laugh. But sometimes when you put it out into mainstream America, or God forbid, put it in a book, then it becomes very uncomfortable. And I think we are still struggling with this line about satire and irony and sarcasm and wit. And I think particularly this generation today, I mean, we've all grown up very ironic, and the Xers are very witty and critical. And, I think we can be very funny, and we have a different approach to humor. But I think even within our own communities, we're very uncomfortable. I mean, I get a lot of slack for some of the things I say. Not particularly because they're not true, but because I just said it out in public where all the white people heard it. So, I mean, that's real. And I think we're definitely making strides. Just for my career, I've just been writing for probably the last 5 years, and I've seen attitudes change, particularly with social media and the internet becoming so pervasive and so many more voices out there, and so many different perspectives being given a forum. But I do think there's still this aspect of underground conversations, and how do we deal with, putting those in the mainstream versus perpetuating stereotypes. I think that's, Dave Chappelle kind of brought that up, like your toe is on that line and sometimes you don't know how far you can go over. So I think we're still struggling a bit, and we've absolutely come leaps and bounds, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to do what I do. But there are definitely still some challenges with what is acceptable for humor, particularly when we're talking about the written word.
Sabrina, how does that hit you consciously?
Well, I also believe that so-called Black humor is urgent. I mean, Jam's title of her book, Mel's title, even it's research, but in my title, I mean, and President Brown, you're a very fine fellow, very articulate. Obviously, Clark Atlanta is a wonderful university, but my book is not a kettle of vultures left beak marks on my forehead. The name of my book is A Kettle of Vultures Left Big Marks on My Forehead. Okay? Because African American humor is loud. It's in your face. It's saying what I've been suppressing to say. And it's the point. It's the bottom line. It's peeled back underneath. It's not polite. It is not fixed. It's not pretty. It is a response to, often it is said it is speaking truth to power, but when a Black comic says it, he's saying it or she's saying it from a powerful position. So as an African-American writer, I get the opportunity to speak and write in subtext, to write what we're all thinking, as opposed to, well, they met the son-in-law and he was a handsome fellow, as opposed to, how come that boy walked with a limp? What we're really thinking, and as human beings, we should take the permission to say and express ourselves as in the subtext. It's so free and it's so much fun.
Yes, it is.
Oh.
Mel, you had a piece that you wanted to share.
Oh, I was just going to read you one of the old stories from the slavery story, just to show how far back humor goes, even during slavery. It's the story of this Pompeii story. It's the interaction between a slave and a master. It shows the direction humor had to go prior to it opening up in the 50s. The master asks the slave, Pompey, how do I look? And the slave says, oh, master, mighty, you looks mighty. What do you mean mighty, Pompey? Why, master, you looks noble. What do you mean by noble? Why, sir, you looks just like a lion. Why, Pompey, where have you ever seen a lion? I saw one down in yonder field the other day, master. Pompey, you foolish fellow, that was a jackass. Was it, master? Well, sir, you looks just like him. And that's the way the humor had to go back before people could speak directly.
And that's Rochester.
Yeah, we've been having that dialogue with each other ever since. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful.
Okay, at this time, we're going to move forward and turn the program back to Dr. Gloria Edwards, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Tom, for presenting Dr. Watkins' video on the historical use of humor by African Americans. And now we would like to turn to our presenters, and I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, who is Dr. Constance Bailey. Dr. Bailey is an assistant professor of African American literature and folklore at Georgia State University. She obtained a BA in English from Alcorn State University and her MA and a PhD from the University of Missouri. Her research focuses on Black women's comedy and humor, contemporary Black speculative fiction, and African American folklore and oral traditions. Her work has appeared in the Mississippi, Folk Life magazine, the Journal of American Folklore, and Meridian Feminism, Race, and Transnationalism Journal at Duke University. Dr. Bailey has presented widely at academic and professional conferences, and she currently serves on the executive committee of the Society for the Study of Southern Literature and the College of Language Associations. She is also a mother of 3, and in her non-existent spare time, she moonlights as a group fitness professional. Our panelists consist of 2 individuals who really are very able to present their point of view, and they are Stacy Peterson. Stacy has been with the University of Michigan School of Social Work since 1999 as a field educator, lecturer, and field liaison. She works primarily with students interested in children and youth, juvenile justice and child welfare, and the school's social work practice concentrations. Prior to this, Stacy Peterson worked in social work at both the macro and interpersonal practice levels. She was a program associate and a field instructor for the University of Michigan's Undergraduate Research Opportunity Program and the Detroit Initiative, where she placed students throughout Wayne and Washtenaw counties to participate in community-based research and community services learning projects in Latino, African American, and Arab community centers. Stacy also has worked for Mercy Network as a social worker for mentally ill substance abusers in Pontiac, Michigan. And lastly, certainly but not least, is Lena Green. Lena Green is someone who discovered comedy in 1997. From the initial connection with the free-spirited, frolic-filled, festive. Until now, the relationship has been nothing less than scintillating. Lena is a graduate of the University of Michigan, and she has majored in side-splitting, hard-hitting shows, but received her degree actually in sociology. Subsequently, her manifold educational and cultural experiences contributed to the diverse, provocative, and insightful, yet expletive-free performances. With the determination of a comedic soldier, Lena engaged and founded Crying Laughter Productions, an organization committed to promoting higher education through comedy. The Flint, Michigan native has performed on a multitude of stages in front of various groups and ages, racial groups as well as social groups as well. Comedy is one of the very special and universal gifts that Lena offers to us all. However, her gifts extend far beyond those gifts that she presents on the comedy stage. She's also an actress, a writer, director, and educator. She has written and directed 3 plays, and as a result of her comedic talent, she was asked to appear as a guest lecturer at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. So without further ado, we'd like to have Dr. Bailey begin our program.
All right, can everyone hear me okay? Excellent.
Yeah, you sound good.
All right, so let's see. Excellent, and we can see the screen, correct?
We can. Your slides look good.
All right, excellent. So good afternoon. It is a pleasure to join you today. Before I begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I join you today from McDonough, Georgia, but my institution is located in Atlanta, Georgia. Both places are part of what was once Muskogee Creek territory. I am thankful for occupying this space. I would also say that while land acknowledgements may feel performative, because ancestor veneration is part of my personal and professional praxis, I feel compelled to offer one in the absence of more restorative justice initiatives. Translation, no shade if you don't provide one, but I feel obligated to do so. Or I sometimes like to say, I like to take the posture that Memphis MC Fitness 2 times says, it's cool when they do it, it's a problem when I do it, right? So something I call a hip hop adage, right? So that's just sort of my personal perspective. For those who may be visually impaired, I'm a plus size African American woman with a milk chocolate complexion. I'm wearing small gold hoop earrings, rainbow colored glasses, and I have a poorly styled short cropped haircut with red tips at the end. I'm wearing a red cloak. So before I enter the more formal part of this discussion, I want to say that I'm not a social scientist, mental health professional, or psychologist or psychiatrist. I have a doctorate of philosophy, not medicine, right? So take my commentary with a proverbial grain of salt. On some, oh wait, how do we get forward? I want to keep this little introductory slide going. All right. On Sunday, October 8th, I attended a comedy show at the Cancun Hip Hop Fest. Clifford T.I.P. Harris was the first comedian to go up. Although known as T.I. during his professional rap career, Tip has recently transitioned into stand-up comedy. To begin his set, T.I. responded to his thunderous applause by saying, "I can tell you know me by my day job." He then continued his set by providing a rationale to the unspoken question of, why are you doing comedy? He said that he was on stage because it's quote unquote cheaper than therapy. I want to tarry here briefly to reflect on these 2 aspects of his set because I think they are relevant to our conversation today. The first point that Tip Harris unintentionally makes is that comedy is his side gig. I would argue that for professional comics who have spent years honing their craft, working their sets, and learning from their comic foremothers and forefathers before them, comedy is not just something they do. It is an integral part of who they are. It involves a certain worldview. I think of it as a calling, and then, of course, professional comics feel free to disagree with me. This is not to say that Tip Harris has not studied his craft, and he's certainly working his set as he attempts to perfect it. Instead, I'm suggesting that the longer he inhabits the space and taps into the liberatory potential of Black humor, which is not to say dark humor, right? African American comedy or humor, he will be less inclined to use it as a punchline for a joke. The latter half of his opening, however, deserves a bit more scrutiny. When Tip says, "I'm on this stage because it's cheaper than therapy," this is a fallacious claim on many levels. While the stage might certainly be, quote unquote, cheaper than therapy for the millions of Americans who are uninsured or underinsured, unlike the average working class Black American, Tip Harris can afford therapy. Secondly, and more importantly, the stage is not synonymous with a therapist's couch or sofa, depending on your regional variation, right? This is not to say that the two things are mutually exclusive. We might certainly vent our frustrations about parenthood, marriage, financial challenges to a willing and listening audience, but we also have an obligation to seek solutions beyond the initial catharsis that the telling provides. An extension of these concerns was espoused by a member of one of my virtual online communities, i.e., a Facebook friend, who said the following: "This can be very damaging within our communities. If we rely too heavily on jokes to express our feelings about challenging topics, we can end up reinforcing harmful stereotypes and oppressive behaviors. And it usually leads to a lack of understanding and empathy and can make it difficult to engage in meaningful conversations. It also reinforces the idea that certain topics are off limits or not appropriate for discussion. The roots of the problem stem from oppression and the fact that people do not have access to emotional mental health care. All schools and communities, for adults and children, should include universal social skills, communication skills, and emotional regulation classes that are facilitated by highly trained and effective facilitators. It's my belief that by exposing folk to this information alone, we encourage people to process humor differently after it's done, since humor will never go away." And that's the end of their quote. In short, what my Facebook friend and others within my community of scholars alludes to is that the jokes are fine, but we have to move beyond simply, quote unquote, laughing to keep from crying. Kevin Hart even titled his 2011 special, "Laugh at My Pain," further solidifying the perception that our personal trauma, hyperbolic though it may be, is fodder for public consumption and should be used for jokes. To be fair, I much prefer comedians use self-deprecating humor and their own experiences instead of what is often referred to as punching down, which is to say targeting those with less power, privilege, money, or cultural cachet as they have. Still, such observations beg the question that if we're laughing at your pain and you're laughing at your pain, who, if anyone, is actually treating the pain? The last observation I want to make before I talk more about a specific type of response in Black expressive culture is an encounter that I had just last night. I attended an event where literary giant Jesmyn Ward was being interviewed by cultural critic and scholar Regina Bradley, and much of the conversation was about grief. Ward made a simple but profound statement when she remarked that just because we lose someone doesn't mean that we stopped loving them. It struck me as especially poignant because writing is a written expression of grief, but jokes and humor outside the context of literary satire are often the oral correlation. They too serve as a to reflect on things lost, be it money, lifestyle, relationships, family members, etc. I start with these anecdotes and this disclaimer not to absolve myself of any personal responsibility as it pertains to the dissemination of said information. Rather, I want to emphasize that jokes, lectures, and humor more broadly are no substitute for mental health evaluation and treatment, nor should they be. Instead, humor, particularly that which is often produced in the context of Black expressive culture and as a result of living this same Black life, right, can be cathartic. It allows us to open ourselves up to the possibility of therapy, and the jokes in their telling and the laughter that follows can absolutely be therapeutic. So with my remaining time, I want to talk a little bit more about a specific type of humor, one that we often see deployed in the Black American community, but kind of specifically among, I want to say youth culture. I'm not that young anymore, maybe middle-aged folks, but certainly a certain generation, right? And that is the proliferation of the internet meme, right? So, and part of this section is extracted from a talk that I gave in 2017. So it's a little dated, right? There have been, I can't even name how many variations of memes that have come about since then. But to the point, I really want to talk about Prince, because I think that was a watershed moment in terms of the creation of this digital medium that allowed for a collective expression of mourning. So from the proliferation of Beyonce's surfboard memes that flooded the internet following the popularity of Queen Bee's Drunken Love single, and of course we know she's had a ridiculous number of songs and albums since then, to Uncle Denzel and Crying Jordan, seemingly nothing and no one was immune to becoming a meme. However, April 21st, 2016 marked a watershed moment in the creation of memes, and surely if Prince had died 1 month earlier, Prince memes, specifically the elegiac ones, would have been listed among the 10 most important Black memes compiled by Brandon Harris for The Root in March of 2016. As opposed to being macabre and irreverent tributes, which some no doubt are, the memes and GIFs that inundated the web after Prince's death were both tragic and really funny, much like the man himself. As such, technology allowed fans to bond and, more importantly, to grieve over a Black cultural icon in ways that they could not when Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston died. Indeed, the very function of the elegiac meme, which I'll define and explore here further, is to provide much needed levity to a grieving community. So it becomes a coping mechanism, right? So for those interested in learning more about the proliferation of memes and other types of humor disseminated via Twitter, X, or whatever it's calling itself these days, I would highly recommend Andre Brock's Distributed Blackness, African American Cyber Cultures. So just real quick, in terms of definitions, in an article titled "It Gets Better, Internet Memes and the Construction of Collective Identity," there's an increasing amount of academic attention being paid to memes. For all this academic attention, however, little has been made of the function of memes as an expression of communal grief. Indeed, much like His Purple Majesty himself, Prince elegiac memes are characterized by their humor. Before exploring this in greater length, a few terms are in order. Elegiac memes are quite different in function from something like a memorial or funeral T-shirt, which is also, it was ubiquitous in African American communities in the South, right, upon someone's death. But they're also an important evolution of the African American elegy, right? So briefly, a meme, small unit of cultural transmission, analogous to genes, spread from person to person by copying or imitation. And then internet memes, by contrast, are either a group of digital items sharing common characteristics of content, form, and or stance, and then which were B, created with an awareness of each other, and then lastly, circulated and transformed via the internet, right? To this digital form, I add the concept of elegy, often resigned to literature. Elegies are poems about being left behind. They are poems too that are themselves left behind as literary and even material legacies. Their heritage helps constitute the work, both process and artifact of mourning, a form of psychic labor that is also fundamental to the work of culture. In their figures of death, elegies seek to apprehend the ultimate, most unknowable condition of privacy while pointing in their language of loss towards the sheer commonality of human experience. Elegy is a genre that enables fantasy about worlds that will outlast us. It prompts ambitious engagement with one of the oldest and most distinguished verse traditions, and it also provides ample literary journey work for the industriously maudlin. To this day, elegy remains capacious, flexible, highly practiced poetic genre. While not a poetic form, their flexibility, ease of dissemination, and their existence into perpetuity have much in common with the literary form. Briefly then, the elegiac meme, as I articulated, is a meme created on the occasion of someone's death. What marks Prince elegiac memes as being unique is that the vast majority of them reflect the trademark humor of the Purple One himself. And if you haven't guessed by now, of course, Prince is my favorite artist, hence this sort of long, treatise about Prince. So these digital creations not only unify a grieving community and provide them with a cathartic release, but their variability allows them to read as either subversive or alternatively as defiant. Whereas many of these memes work in the service of patriarchy, sexism, heterosexism, and a litany of other privileges, Prince memes have the potential to be so much more. So in same article I cited earlier, it gets better. Schiefman and Comp suggest that, quote, one way to measure if a meme has created a polyvocal discourse is variability. And when the multiple versions created by numerous users significantly differ from each other, the potential for polyvocal discourse increases, end quote. As such, the categories of Prince memes help us understand not only something about the creators of such memes, but the memes themselves open up infinite possibilities for understanding the relationship and the nuance between grief and mourning. The following genres of Prince elegiac memes are not in any particular order, and in fact, these are categories that I created, right? So feel free to disagree about them. But there are memes that reflect on his body of work and musical contributions, memes that reflect on Prince's supreme personal style and swag, memes about grieving, memes about Prince tributes. So in that way, they're kind of meta commentaries. And lastly, but certainly not least, Prince parody memes. Notice that these memes are intertextual, engaging with the larger pop culture and African American culture alike. Rarely, in the case of the music in the schools memes, they are didactic. And I'll show you an example so that expression makes more sense. But almost always they are funny, with the memes themselves reflecting the legendary shade that the artist himself was known to throw, right? We might also say that the memes signify on Prince's personal ethos. And of course, we had a brief discussion about signifying when we mentioned the great Mel Watkins' work. So before I just go through a few of the slides, we want to offer this last quote. Gall, Schiefman, and Kampf argue that, quote, memes are closely related to the process of norm formation, end quote. As such, meme creators help establish and maintain the boundaries of appropriate behavior within the community. This process of negotiation is by no means theoretical. Instead, the process, quote, requires a realization of a communicative act of compliance or subversion, end quote. Goffman, Schief, and Comp further suggest that because of the public platform of this genre, internet memes may be even more ideally suited for policing boundaries of acceptable behavior. But more so than articulating a concern with policing the appropriate use of Prince memes, those deeply immersed in Prince's life and legacy were more concerned with using the accessibility, the variability, and the power of the meme to create a collective lament. In fact, a long internet wail of mourning. And so then just kind of briefly going through some of these, this, URLs of course change. So you may be able to find this. It's not, I won't try to click the link anymore because I think it's no longer in the same place, but it plays on that, it's a GIF that plays on the, Shirley Caesar, the Thanksgiving one. I've got greens, beans, tomatoes, but it's Prince dancing and he's kind of amazing doing that. And then of course that's a few other Prince GIFs. And so this is just, if you think about some of those categories I identified as a thought exercise, you could try to place those if you want. But of course, this first one, Robin doesn't know the lyrics to a Prince song. We've got, again, Prince was, I don't know if he was as well known for his work as a philanthropist as he should have been, but he was very much an advocate of the arts in schools and, contributed widely, certainly in Minnesota, but I think in other places as well. Again, some humor, right? There's usually the punchline is in the second half of the meme, right? So, and in this case, the punchline is actually in the visual, right? So when someone tells you to stop grieving over Prince, you throw them out of a moving vehicle, right? This, of course, folks were up in arms about the tribute that different entities did upon Prince's death. And so, we've got, of course, Morris Day. This, again, people who are familiar with Prince's body of work, like any kind of joke, right? They're contextual, so we get the joke. And again, just a few others. again, intersecting with Black culture. So those of you who are familiar with And Live in Color, you see not just, there's, this sort of riffs off the shade of the previous ones in terms of the inadequate tribute that was paid to Prince via billboards, Prince performance, Prince celebration. And then of course you got commentary, right? Hated it, for those of you who recall the skit on In Living Color. Of course, this and Chappelle is a whole other conversation about humor, which we could talk about maybe if time allows. I think the Q&A has actually been tabled for the end. I usually embed a little bit of time at the talk, but I think you all have been directed to place those questions in the Q&A. But for those who want to get in touch with me or follow up, this is how you can do so. And yeah, I want to stop now and get ready to turn it over to Miss Stacy Peterson, who will talk, I think, more with you all about humor and mental health.
Stacy, we'll have you on mute.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to meet you and see you here. I'm about to share my slides. Pull my screen up there. Can you see my slides?
We can.
They look good.
Super, thank you. So I am Stacy Peterson. You heard about my introduction. I also work as a mental health provider. So I am a therapist in a private practice. I have a clinical and macro social work distinction. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about healing through humor and joy. And I'm going to try to make sure you can see everything. So just a few slides. What I thought when I was asked to do this presentation is I thought about humor, and as Mr. Myrie shared, that history of how it's worked in the Black community, how we've used it as a coping mechanism and a healing mechanism, and also a way to be clever when dealing with oppressive systems. So I thought, what is the definition of humor? So there's a noun portion, but there's also an action portion. So the humor, the quality of being amusing or comic, often expressed through medium, art, literature, memes. The action is it's a mood or a state of mind. And I took that a little further to also think of joy. Joy, the noun, is a feeling of great pleasure and happiness, but there's also an action associated with joy. The action is to feel glad, to be joyful, to rejoice. And so as I prepare for the talk, as a mental health practitioner, we're often thinking about how do we infuse humor and joy to help us feel better. So how can humor help us? And so there are places, and again, I'm moving, if you see that black screen move around, that's just the visual that I have on my side. I thought about some of the top ways that humor helps us in our day-to-day living and action. So one of those ways is there is a physical benefit from using humor. The physical, we release endorphins. It has significant proven evidence-based healthcare benefits that we want to think about as I'm very much a therapist who talks about my intention. I know that the world is hard and there are many bad things happening. I have to intentionally focus on how do I take care of myself so that I can be the human being that I want to be. So there's a physical benefit from using humor, from laughing. So there's physical things that happen in our body, our chemical. So we release endorphins, which are the feel-good hormones. We also have another benefit around the notion of stress relief. Laughing and using humor actually decreases tension in our whole body, which again has a physical effect and a mental health well-being. We lower our blood pressure. We've seen heart rate go down, really good stress relief and reduction of negative adverse health effects. Using humor in the workplace has also been shown to increase job functioning and work satisfaction. And so when we think about the racism and oppression that Black people have experienced in American culture and history, we've actively done these things to help us cope and survive. And so now there's research to back up what we know. Another benefit of using humor is there's an actual benefit to our immune system. I put down the word neuropeptides, and those are biological chemicals that boost our immunity, increase our health and well-being. There is an emotional benefit to how humor can help us. So we lower anxiety and depression. And when we see humor used in an academic setting, in our educational setting, using humor can enhance our learning and ability to hold interest and grasp a concept. So that's a little bit about how we can use humor to help us, the action verb. One of the things that we hear and know, I've already expressed, there are many, many challenges and difficulties in the world right now. And so we can be intentional about increasing our use of humor. And so there's some tips here. One of those tips is to focus on what makes you happy. And so as we think about moving forward in our work, in our lives, some of the things that I know that intentionally make me happy. Number one, I want to thank Dr. Bailey because I am a big Prince fan. So being able to find music and art and culture, but also cooking and food and family, the things that make me happy where I can express humor, I'm focused and intentional about taking care of those things. Another concept to increase our humor is to embrace a giving spirit. And giving is not just materialistic. It's actually, and I put giving and service as two different things, but giving time, spending time with people who are not negative, who are positive, to give of myself in ways, that create opportunities for humor to occur. So I think about spending, like when you hear people laughing, to go over and put myself in the company of people who are actively engaging in humor. Also service. So to me, service is, we can see it from our work in our day jobs, in our work in volunteering, in our work in serving community, going to the food kitchen. Where I'm gathering and doing good work, I often find humor, and we encourage us to do that across the lifespan. Another way that we can work to increase our humor is to practice discernment. So there's a difference between humor as a coping mechanism and a defense mechanism. So sometimes defense mechanisms halt our healing and prevent us from engaging in problem-solving behavior. Coping means, yes, things are challenging and difficult, but I am going to manage so that I can move forward and be successful. So one of the ways to increase our humor is to acknowledge that we have stress and we need to deal with it, but we also can have all our feelings. And when something is not good, we can own that and we can move on. So when we talk about humor and moving forward, one of the things that I read in just preparing for this was that there are many tools and resources that are available to us that allow us to engage in humor. And some of those things are social media and memes and funny TV shows, other ways to have fun. We talk about remember funny things happening. Surrounding yourself with people who have a good heart and spirit, and simple things that feel, as an adult, I'm like, oh, I'm not going to do this. There's a lot of research that says to embrace your inner child, and based on your family history and your life history and your emotional health and well-being, you might have to introduce yourself to your inner child and create that inner child and have that inner child relationship that you didn't get to have when you were children, because many of us who grew up with the struggle, we were parentified children. So we had to help our siblings. We had to help our parents who had to work because of our economic status. So one of the things that I do now as an adult is I do color. And it's pretty funny because now my kids are giving me coloring books and me and my grandkids were just coloring together. So what are the ways that we can have fun to not just to be intentional with embracing humor? So another way to have fun is to laugh at yourself. They talk about, sharing your embarrassing moments. I don't know about all that, but I do know that as we talk about being self-critical, to change the energy from being self-critical to engaging in laughter and humor about the mistakes that we make. And I think that's also beneficial because we're modeling to the next generation. It's okay to make a mistake. It's how we learn. It's how we grow. To take ourselves less seriously. One of the funny stories that I tell, in 2019, I have 3 children. My daughter was moving, she and her husband, and they had a washer and dryer that their new place had a washer and dryer, and they couldn't take their current washer and dryer. And, I want to help them, but without giving them money, which I'm sure we know about that. But I said, I'll buy your washer and dryer. So I live here in Michigan. My daughter and her husband live in Cleveland. I rented a truck. I drove to Cleveland at 4:00 in the morning, the day they were moving. My son-in-law put the washer and dryer on the back of the truck, and I was driving back, and it was Halloween weekend. So this is fresh on my mind. So as I'm leaving Cleveland, it's torrential downpour, and as often is for Halloween, it was like 40 degrees. It was cold. So the tarp on the back of the truck is blowing off of the washer and dryer. And my daughter and her husband are very techie people. So they have this really fancy electronic washer and dryer. And so I'm like, oh, so I'm pulling over on the highway, trying to tie these tarps down. I'm by myself. It's pouring rain. I'm soaking wet. I keep imagining the tarp flying off this truck, off the back of the pickup truck I'm driving, and into the face of a truck flying down, 480 in Ohio. People are flying and it's raining. And I'm like, I want to cry because I'm soaking wet and I can't get this tarp to stay down. And then I start thinking about life. And as I'm wrapping the tarp around it and I'm soaking wet, I'm like, I'm going to laugh about this in a few years. And then I was like, no, I'm going to laugh about this today, because if I can laugh about this tomorrow, I can laugh about it today. And in the reframing of this incident that could have been, it was challenging, but I chose to be joyful about it, because it is a funny story now when I say, here I am on the side of the highway, soaking wet to my underwear, trying to get the tarp to fall down. And I eventually got it and I made it back home. And it's a funny story that we tell about also. And I think it relates to this topic of being a Black person. I always say, I fold. I mean, I bend, but I don't break. I don't fold. And I am going to find a point of joy in everything. And because that's how I move forward and function. I encourage that in my clients. I also share, in 2020, I was diagnosed with cancer and I had a really hard time. And so through my cancer journey, everything that could go wrong, every side effect, it was difficult. But I remember I was talking to my cancer doctor, my oncologist, and she says to me, you always have a great attitude. And I said, I figured it out. I can have cancer and be happy, or I can have cancer and be miserable. I still have cancer. Misery doesn't serve me. I've seen a legacy of that from my, parents and grandparents and my elders, about finding that point of joy and humor so that I can function. That's what I choose to do. So have fun, use your tools, use your resources, ask questions. I found this quote by Kevin Hart, laughter heals all wounds. And that's the one thing that everybody shares. No matter what you're going through, it makes you forget about your problems. I think the world should keep laughing. That's from Kevin Hart. So I talk about, I make it a point to choose joy every day. I find a point of joy every day. Some quotes I found about joy. Joy is held in our heart and it comes out in our humor, and my happiness shows on my face. Joy transcends, and happiness is a reaction to everything that's happening, and it brings me joy. So joy is a practice and a behavior. It's deliberate and intentional. Being happy will come and go, but if I utilize all these challenges that I encounter to focus on my humor and bring me joy, I'm going to move forward happy, positive, and more healthy. It's the way that we put our oxygen mask on. So I want to thank you for your time. I'm going to, the next voice you hear will be Lena Green. I thank you, and I'll be available for questions at the end of our time together.
Thank you, Stacy. Great job. And thank you, Dr. Bailey, for kicking this off. I am comedian Lena Green. I am a professional comedian. And first, I'm just happy to be here. As you all know, we just came out of a pandemic. And one thing about this particular pandemic is everything was shut down. And that was a problem for comedians because we are out in the open. So in an area where you had a pandemic, this is the time you really needed laughter and humor. And even that was shut down to a certain extent. But there's some good that came out of the pandemic. It's so interesting because every time I talk, and just like like Stacy just mentioned, is you can decide how you want to view it. And I'll say as a comedian, we're trained just the way that we think in our thinking to see the humor in just about anything. And so when I think about the pandemic, even though the pandemic was hard, there were some good things that happened in the pandemic. So just think about it. First of all, before the pandemic, I know there was a lot of folks and all they did was eat fast food. People started to cook home-cooked meals finally. Kids were having home-cooked meals for probably the first time that they've ever had it. So when you think about home-cooked meals, I grew up in a house where I always had home-cooked meals. You know, in fact, my mother didn't believe in fast food. The first time I ever had fast food was by accident. Okay, that's what okay, let me explain. I know some people are like, what do you mean? So the first time I ever had fast food was by accident. I grew up in a family of 9 kids, big family. I am the second oldest of 9 children. My mom would go in the morning, take us to school, drop us off. She would come back that afternoon, pick us up, and stop at McDonald's and get her a meal. And my mama would get her a meal and get her some fries, and she'll be eating it all the way. And we'd be like, Mama, can we get some of them fries? My mama eating, no, baby, this ain't good for you. This ain't good for you. And then we'd be like, she was like, I got you a home-cooked meal at home. So sure enough, we would have a home-cooked meal at home. But my mom did this for years. And she continued to do that. So one day she followed her regular routine, took us to school, picked us up, stopped at McDonald's, got her a meal. And kids, we're resilient. We're going to keep asking. She eating her fries. Mama, come on, give us some fries. She's like, no, baby, this ain't good for you. Then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this car comes in. He runs the red light. Boom, he crashed into our car. My mama fries go in the air. We're green. French fries! French fries! I told y'all the first time I ever had fast food was by what? Accident. Y'all thought I was playing. I was eating fries and glass all at the same time to go, oh, this is good, but it hurt. But it's interesting because when you think about that, people are now eating home-cooked meals, and that's what I grew up on. The other issue with the pandemic is they laid off a lot of people. There was a lot of people who lost jobs during the pandemic. And when I think about that, now as an employer, I'm actually short-staffed. And a lot of you are on jobs where you don't have enough people right now. So when you think about that, I am short-staffed. I work for an institution that requires people to actually take drug tests. So it's getting to the point now where I find really good candidates and they're not passing their drug test. So now I'm going to HR saying, okay, I just have these 2 good candidates. You're telling me I can't hire them because they didn't pass the drug test. So what are we talking, cocaine or weed? Because if they're high off weed, they can probably work in customer service. If they're on cocaine, they can probably process these claims faster. Then at that point in time, I'm looking at whatever I can do differently with these folks. But when you look at that, you're looking at how do you change something and make it better, right? So you change it. So I want to talk about this. I'm going to pull up a presentation really quick. And I want to talk about what I just did was I use, when I set up comedians, when we set up our jokes, what we do a lot of times when you hear what I just talked about, my first joke was called fast food by accident. Now, what I can tell you as a child, there was nothing funny about my mom eating fries and we couldn't have it. So can you imagine there's 9 kids in the car and none of us can get any fries? That is not funny. However, as a comedian, I do see the humor in that. So what I thought about was you think about here's a large family of 9. I'm denied something that most kids or all kids probably want. And it also reflects a poverty. So what my mom would say is, no, you can't have it. But what was happening is we really couldn't afford for her to buy McDonald's for 9 kids. So I take that particular real life story and with a car crash, there is nothing good about a car crash. But as a comedian, when I start to think about it, I got some French fries that day. Right now, that anybody else would think there is nothing hilarious. Oh, it was funny because I've been asking for some fries for some years. So here's a car crash. We actually had injuries and there was trauma. But what I can talk about from a funny and comical standpoint is my mama fries went in the air and we was all jumping and getting us some fries. And we ate some fries that day. So when you think about that, here's the scenario, here's either injury and trauma, and I had to turn that tragedy using humor as a coping mechanism because I came from the city of Flint, a really tough city, very poverty stricken, as Stacey mentioned before, and I was one of those people that took care of the younger kids. So I had a huge responsibility. So in looking at that level of responsibility and the different things that we went through, I, as a kid, tend to think of things in the comical form. And so went from critical to comical and then from crying to laughter. So for things that we would normally cry about. And in fact, my siblings, I have an older sister, went through the same thing, but instead of her using humor, she was a fighter. So she would fight. And that was her mechanism of dealing. So you can come from the same family and have a different way of using a different mechanism. So I think about the short staff. In a lot of situations, there is nothing funny about being short-staffed because you have overworked, long shifts, people are tired and exhausted. In most cases, people are underpaid. And depending on where you work, you may also experience a lot more customer complaints because you're understaffed. So think about the whole concept of drug testing. So me as a leader, I've gone through recruiting, interviewing. Now I get these great people who have failed their drug test, and now I'm on to reconsideration because I'm like, something has got to give. So when you think about that whole drug testing and using that as humor, it's the same thing that Kevin Hart did. His dad was an addict. And when you think about what he used in his humor as well, he took a situation that I can guarantee you was very painful for him as a kid and turned that tragedy and used that humor as a coping mechanism. And so he too went from critical to comical and from crying to laughter. So when you look at the way that these are built and the way that we construct our humor and our jokes, and a lot of times when you hear things that really is more of a tragedy and turned into humor, a lot of times those things come from a very real place. And that is a way of coping. And so as was mentioned earlier, in your life, in your workplace, it is really good to add humor to your event. So if you are looking to add a clean comedian and humor to your event, here's my information. I do, in fact, during the pandemic, although a lot of the comedy clubs and things like that were shut down, there was a lot of radio, Zoom. People were really looking to book comedians just so that key humor and that comedy can come out. So I am available also, and I am a clean comedian, always have been. So churches, conferences, schools, retreats, birthday parties, retirements, family reunions. If you are looking for that tool to help you with that coping mechanism, you can look to me as a comedian. And I will turn it back over to our host. I will. Thank you. Gloria and Audrey Lucas.
Let me say I'm just delighted to have been able, and I hope that's the same for all of our audience, to hear such varied points of view about
Hi, Gloria. We lost you. Your mic went mute again. Can you start over?
Can you hear me now? Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
I was saying that I'm just delighted that we've been able to present to you an overview of humor in the African American community. We wanted to give you a broad perspective of what it is like, from the history that we gave you, its early beginning, to really talking about the fact that humor can be also have impact upon us, both emotional and physically, and how we then use it really to become people who are able to really use bad experiences to feel a sense of still being in touch with ourselves. And then we heard an example of how that's used in terms of Professor, Bailey's example using her impressions of Prince and the reactions that were experienced by others about his death. Finally, Lena was able to share with us what a comedian does in terms of actually being able to use incidents that are commonplace in people's lives and turn them into a sense of humor, which is very important. I think humor really is a mechanism that African Americans, as well as others, have used really to feel a sense of unity and a feeling of identity that we have, that we can share together, that really can last a lifetime. With that said, then, we want to see if there are some questions that you may have. And so I'm going to look at the question and answer area and see if there are questions that you have for our panelists. I'm just reading these for the first time. Let me see if there are other questions here that are coming up. And Jason, you may need to help me with this. Are you also seeing questions that are coming up?
Gloria, there are not any questions in the Q&A, but if any of the participants would like to put their questions in the Q&A by clicking on the Q&A icon, and you can type your questions in. There are some pre-submitted questions, however, that Gloria will start with. But while she's going over the pre-submitted questions, if you'd like to ask the keynote speaker or any of the panelists questions, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A chat.
This is a question that may be answered by anyone who has been presenting today. And we have heard something about the evolution of African-American humor from particularly Dr. Watson. But is there anyone who would like to elaborate on it from the standpoint of the changes or the different types of humor that have really come about through a long period since slavery to our present day? Is humor different in the way it is expressed now than it was previously? What forms does it take that are different now than in previous years? Would anyone like to respond to that question?
Well, I can. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Lena.
I think that was Dr. Bailey coming with her comment first.
Go ahead, Stacey. I will mute you. I'm going to defer to you.
Oh, I will start. I think we all have something to say. One of the things that I think about how humor has changed over time is, I think that what we learned earlier and what we've not seen is that we are a smart and crafty people. So the story about, oh, I thought it was a lion and that was a jackass, is really speaking to our cleverness and the way that we know how to move within systems. I think one of the ways that I feel like humor has really changed over time is that when Black people have expressed happiness or joy, it has been seen as frivolous, or we've been, infantized. And I love Audre Lorde, who says that, our self-care, right? Laughter is self-care. Self-care is not indulgence. It's actually self-preservation. And that is seen as social warfare for us as a people. So I think that that's really something that I hold dear about why it's important to laugh and take care of myself, because it is social warfare. I'm going to turn it over to Candace now. I'm sorry, Constance.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, that is a great question, but and it's so broad, right? So when I think about humor, like my first engagement with humor is like my grandmother, right? Who, would just have, I don't know if you call it proverbial wisdom, but things like, you got to shit or get off the pot, things that I thought were hilarious, but were profound, right? Which I think is a little bit different from comedy. And Watkins' more comprehensive history, in my mind, well, it does a lot, right? It talks about the origins of slavery, but it also looks at like the evolution of stand-up comics too. So you even have, I think there's a chapter with like Marsha Warfield and other different popular entertainers. So the one thing I might just say in terms of that particular, professional and sort of stand-up comedy, I think social media, but also just, our awareness or understanding of identity politics means that you wouldn't probably have like a stand-up special like Eddie Murphy Raw or Delirious that was, so immensely, popular and successful. But also so many of the jokes were at the expense of, gay people and different types of marginalized groups. So you have a lot more awareness of, again, what some people call punching down, where people are a lot more sensitive to those who are disenfranchised, and a lot less. You still have comedians who are immensely popular, but there's at least public pushback. So there's not necessarily this hesitance. So I think I see, especially with someone like Kevin Hart, who's, been kind of one of the most, popular stand-up comics of the last decade, a lot more emphasis on self-deprecating humor, right? Jokes at his own expense, because that's more palatable, I think, for people. And also, to our point, like, laughing at some of the things that we endure is helps. I think it's sort of personally, cathartic. So those are some rambling thoughts.
Very good. They're all very important.
I'll just do a quick comment if that's okay. I will together from a personal as a comedian and the development of me becoming a professional comedian. I will say I was one of those people always had a regular job and, running the comedy scene as well. And there's two things I noticed. One, I did not tell people in my workplace that I was a stand-up comedian because I wanted to be respected as a leader, right, in my field. And I did not want people to see me as a joke per se. However, on the weekends, I'm flying out, right? I'm doing all this stuff. And I was like this undercover until somebody actually saw me perform. It was like, hey, we didn't know. I even used different names because I was very strategic and making sure in my professional role, I wanted to be treated as a professional Black woman under what I went to school to be. However, even in the comedy realm, I was one of the very few comedians that were female and one of the only who were clean. So there's another thing that now you see more people looking for clean comedians and will book a female, but that was very rare when I was coming up. I mean, literally, you would go up in there like, okay, you need to just go on to church because this is not the event for you, because I was not saying the same things that other people were saying. That was just not who I was. And one of the things you have to do as a comedian, you have to be true to what you know. You have got to bring material that you know. So I had to find audiences. And in fact, they found me, even in the clubs where I really don't like going, they would call me and say, you'll be great for my church. You'll be great for my businesses. And so I started to go to places where they really respected my level of clean comedy. But it was, in the very beginning, it was very hard as a female and clean comedian to come. But now I see there's more and more businesses that book me and churches because that's what they're looking for now.
Very good. Thank you for your answers. There's another question that has come up, and it has to do with how does humor intersect with other coping mechanisms within the African American culture, such as music or literature or art?
Yeah,
I would like to respond to that.
If nobody else can, I mean, those are things, as a cultural studies and literature scholar, I think a lot about and write a lot about the intersection of all those things. And I don't see them as being, mutually exclusive. Like, I write a lot about, one of the, I give talks sometimes. There's a scholar who writes about African American foodways, and so she looks at Chris Rock's Bigger and Blacker and The Big Piece of Chicken and talking about sort of gender dynamics in Black households. But then I will use that same sketch to talk about and talk about foodways in African American music and what we see represented. So I see, they're different ways, and it depends on, I think, on the content creator, honestly, also, like, different ways to channel that creativity. And Jesmyn Ward, again, was writing through her grief. Some folks, if you think about the tradition of a Billie Holiday, right, A Strange Fruit, singing about some of the political injustices and discrimination that we faced. Zora Neale Hurston behind me, like, one of my favorite writers, who's so important, but also, so darn funny, right? And so yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of it depends on the creative themselves, but I see them as not being mutually exclusive, but they kind of inform each other, and they can kind of work together to provide that emotional outlet for Black folks.
Very good. Any other comments about this question? Another question that we've had has to do with, are there perhaps any potentially difficult or limitations that relying upon the use of humor can have for African Americans?
Well, from a therapy standpoint, I talked a little bit about if we only use humor as a defense mechanism and we don't also take care of our mental health and well-being, we stop our healing journey. And so I think that there is a place for humor, but there's also a place for healing, and healing requires hard work. And so it might be funny to do depreciating humor at some point, but there's also a place where we have to not be the comic relief and do our hard work. And so I've actually had a story. My husband was at a job, and he was saying that there were people at the job who wanted him to make jokes and be funny, like comedic relief. And he is like, I'm here to work. So there's a way that we always have to navigate however we show up. And that doesn't stop within the realm of humor. So I would say we want to be careful to make sure that in addition to using humor for our own coping, that we're also making sure we deal with the problems as they come up. Like, for example, I shared that I had cancer. I wasn't joking. Like, people were like, oh, it's like, no, I still need to go to the doctor. All jokes aside, we here laughing and I'm joking with you, but you need to give me my test results. So there's a place for humor to manage, but there's also a place to take care of as we say, handle your business.
And Stacey, I think you make a great point, because I will say growing up, mental health, you just dealt with it. You know what I mean? Like, you were not going to see a therapist. Whatever happens in the house stays in the house. And that was very damaging, because there's a lot of things that needed some help outside of that household. But the other thing that I will say as a comedian, you really have to know your audience to know what humor to use. If I'm going to church, it's certain humor that's not accepted at that church. That's just not, and they're in the business place. When I do humor, there are certain things that's just unacceptable there. So you also need to know your audience, but it's also timing. As a professional, I do now use humor in my regular day-to-day, but it's very strategic. I don't want to be viewed as every time I come, I'm the joke. No, I use it to calm, in most cases where there's a conflict, where teams are not getting along. And it's like that humor that like just brings everybody together and go, oh, you know what? That's funny. Let's get, So it's very strategic as well. So that's my comment.
Thank you very much for your comments. Jason, are there any questions that we have in our Q&A?
We do now have 5 questions in the Q&A chat section, Glory, for you to click on the Q&A chat button and read the questions.
All right. I have one that says, I can relate to this presentation and am so grateful that I took time to attend this event. To me, humor has changed in that the tellers are not so much the elders. And that isn't really a question, but rather a statement. And how do you feel about that? Or what is your reaction? Dr. Bailey and Lena and Stacey? That the tellers are no longer, excuse me, so much the elders, but they have changed in terms of being of all ages, apparently.
I agree. As a comedian, I can say I see comedians of all ages and backgrounds perform, and they're telling their stories and their humor according to where they are. So from my scope and where I travel, there's a lot of, there is not one age group I've ever been on stage with. It has always been a different age group, races, and backgrounds. So.
Yeah, I think the other thing about that too is that I don't, of course, the person who commented is anonymous, but depending on the age, they may not be thinking about, like I'm thinking about comedy when you think about the Richard Pryors, the Paul Mooneys, and people who had to sort of go through even, Monique, the quote unquote queens of comedy, who had to go through this process, almost not really indoctrination, but like that there was this rite of passage and here's how you became a comic. Now, because of the different platforms, you got creators who are, they're TikTok comedians. They are, I can't tell you how many reels of this one young man who probably could be my child, but he's like, in his house coat doing this, granddad thing or whatever. And it's hilarious to me because, we know so many people who, it's reminiscent of, whatever. And so they have, younger folks have different mechanisms for distributing their humor, and they don't necessarily have to undergo that same sort of process to become a quote unquote comedian or comic. I will say though, because they're very different mediums, it doesn't always, translate well for folks who, have, come to fame on TikTok or whatever, and then try to go into a comedy club or to, sort of work a set. Is not the same thing. And, working and interacting with a real audience. So that can be, hit or miss depending on, the level of preparation that person had. But yeah, we see all ages, all types of comics now.
And that is a good thing.
Excellent point. I just want to elaborate on Dr. Bailey's point about being a stand-up comedian is very different with a live audience and you are responding to their reaction. It is very, very different than what she hit it on the nail on the head. It's very different. And it is actually, in my opinion, a different level. It's definitely harder to perform in front of a live audience versus somebody can go and click on it and say, I like it or don't, because then your feelings are hurt, right? as a comedian, you either, they love you or you don't. But it is a very different platform. And in fact, I've had people who come to me and say, hey, I want to be a comedian. I've done all this. And when you try to coach them and bring them to the stage, it is a talent, it is an art, it is not something you can just jump and do. And they don't do well at it in a lot of those situations. I'm like, okay, let's stick to doing what you were doing. You were good at that, but this has not panned out. But it is a very different art form.
God. I think all of us can probably see the questions, but the next one has to do with culture, cancel culture. It has to do with how has cancel culture impacted Black comedy? First of all, does anyone have a definition of cancel culture?
I would like to jump in for that one first, just because my first published piece was about Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle, which, to some degree, both have been quote unquote canceled. Now, I don't necessarily have a, whatever the working definition, like cancel culture is this idea that people are, being like unceremoniously, sort of criticized, losing their endorsements. They're being, publicly shamed for things that people perceive as being quote unquote politically incorrect. And I think, I'm kind of in the camp of people that's a misnomer, and that a lot of the folks who are quote unquote canceled are still wealthy. They still have, in many cases, men, so they still have patriarchal privilege. They get, even in the backlash, they're getting hits and clicks and likes. So I'm really of that camp. And some of those comics who have been quote unquote canceled are still, I stand by those routines, for that time and place. Like they hold up well, or they're useful for whatever, purpose or function that they serve. But what I will say is that, I'm in the camp, or I'm of the mind that, consequences is not the same as being canceled. Like if you do a thing publicly, just expect that, there are consequences. So if you say something that is discriminatory against, that's anti-Semitic, then don't, you're not being canceled when someone says, hey, I don't want you to play my platform because my background, my family is Jewish, right? That's not to me, you're not being canceled. You're dealing with the consequences of your actions. So that's kind of interesting. So I might even be of the mind that cancel culture is a mythological thing instead of a real thing, but I'm not sure. I don't know about that part. But so yeah, I think that the people are being more sensitive to the types of jokes that they tell. When they aren't, they are having to deal with whatever public backlash. So that's what I would say in terms of how it's affected Black comedy. I don't think it's, comedians who are going to do quote unquote edgy things, or who are going to tell, like some of Chappelle's jokes have been transphobic. He's doubled down. Like he's still going to, so creators are going to do what they want to do, but to Lena's point earlier, you do have, I'm a big fan of like Kev on stage. There's another young guy like, you know, who are doing kind of clean, even quote unquote Christian comedy, I would say. And so I think, you know, you got probably the popularity of more folks like that due to some folks who have, you know, really committed to being anti whatever, you know, or, you know, and so it kind of is what it is, but I don't know that it, you know, I think some people are more cautious in their public performances is what I would say.
One of the questions that I would ask in reference to this question is that in the African-American experience, the humor has been often not only directed towards ourselves, but also towards whites. And that's a general population. I mean, how far is it that we take this cancel culture concept in terms of, we can certainly see its relevance as far as specific ethnic groups such as Jews. But if it's more broadly, a joke is more broadly told about, say, majority population, is that where we're going in terms of curtailment for everyone who is different from ourselves? Or is it just relating to special groups that we need to be more sensitive in terms of what we're saying? Anyone want to respond to that?
Well, this is Stacy. What I'm thinking about is a lot of comedy comes from our own personal experience. So if I've had an experience with, you know, so for example, I go to therapy and my therapist is a Latino man. And I was telling him something that happened to me as a Black woman. And I used the term Black woman versus woman of color because I have women of color who are my friends who do not have the same experiences as me as a Black woman. So I'm going to say that. But I was telling him something about me having an experience with a white woman as a Black woman, and he busted out laughing. And then he's like, I'm sorry. And I was like, no, I needed you to laugh at that because that was some funny stuff. And if you didn't get the humor in that, I can't move forward and get you to understand what I'm experiencing. So as we talk about cancel, I think people have a right to talk about their own experiences and how they experience other people. I have the right to say, so for example, I have many friends who are in the LGBTQAI plus community. And, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates says this, I don't have relationship to tell certain kind of jokes with certain kind of people. Like people don't have relationship to say the N-word. They're not in that group. I just don't listen to those things. So if people are doing misogynist or hateful things towards women, I don't find that funny. So I don't participate in that. You like it, I love it. I think people have to think with their mind and make their own choices. And I determine how I'm going to spend my money. I wouldn't go see a comic who did certain things, but I think everyone should have the choice to do what makes the most sense for them, if that makes sense.
Very good. Thank you, Stacy. Our next question has to do with, is directed towards all of you who are presenters. Who are some of your comedic influences that have helped you as a coping mechanism throughout your life? Is the question clear?
Yeah, I can go first. I will say, speaking of cancel culture, Bill Cosby has definitely been, you know, I grew up watching him, listening to him, you know, Cosby Show. And as a comedian, I am also an actress and a writer. And so I do a lot of acting. And that's the type of thing I look at comedians who have transferred from, and most comedians want to do acting. Let me just be clear. A lot of us, when we start off, that is our form of acting as a one-person show, you know, and then you move into the acting realm. As you can see, everybody doesn't move into the acting realm as successfully, but we do. The other, Wanda Sykes, I think is hilarious, but also Whoopi Goldberg. And although Whoopi Goldberg is like my mom's age, she did a one-woman show. And I remember watching her documentary because when you go out, and even when I go out now and an agent calls and you're auditioning, you audition a lot for parts that you think you should get, and we're not getting it for various reasons. So what she did is she created her own one-woman show, and I ended up doing the exact same thing, saying I don't have to wait for these agents to call me back. I can go do, and I watched Whoopi do it, and she played all these characters. And that was probably the first time on stage I was able to be comedic, dramatic, and do all the ways of acting that I knew how to do. And so those were some of my folks that inspired me.
Thank you, Linda. Dr. Bailey or Stacy, any comments about this question?
Yeah, Lena, you got me thinking about Fontaine. Whoopi as Fontaine. Yes, I remember that. I like a range. So lately, my kids have turned me on to Tom Segura and John Mulaney, but I also love me some Samoa. I like Lavelle Crawford when he says, you know, your mama gonna hit you in the throat. I brought you here to take you out. Wanda Sykes, Whoopi Goldberg. I've liked Sinbad. I'm open to listening to different things. And so those are some of the people that I like. Yeah, those are the folks that I enjoy.
Yeah, I'm a big, as a child of the 80s, I grew up with a lot of sketch comedy. And speaking of, like Lena mentioning the transition, from or the connection between comedy and acting, I was a huge In Living Color fan. So thinking about like Jamie Foxx's success on the stage was no surprise because his stand-up was great. But so, sketch comedy has been my foray, aside from my grandma, to go back to her, was the funniest person I knew, God rest her soul. But so Key and Peele, of course, I was a big fan of the Chappelle Show, doing much more of my own personal research with Black women's humor, in part because of my grandmother. And so the Queens of Comedy, writing about all of their stuff. And then most recently, Black Lady Sketch Show, which I can't say enough good things about. I almost, made a portion of the talk about intersectionality in the Black Lady Sketch Show, because there's a great skit with Patti LaBelle, and she's giving this advice to this younger Black woman about relationships in the way that our ancestors do, but she's like, endorsing the boo, but she's like, wait, I said but I still don't like your ass, like basically, invoking this grandma spirit, like I like you, but I don't like, I don't like you like that. And so I would really say, and it's sadly, just had its last season, but if you're not familiar with that, I would strongly encourage folks to watch that. It's really, really a great platform. And then that last season, one of the comedians, Angel, what's Angel's last name? I forget, but I follow a lot of her social media stuff, and she's just been having a great kind of season in terms of, had a single that came from she was just improvising on the show, and then it became a song, and it was like a breakout. I think it has a Grammy nomination now, actually. So I would really encourage folks to check out those comics if you're not familiar with a Black Lady Sketch Show. And of course, everyone loves the young woman who did Abbott Elementary, who was also a regular on a Black Lady Sketch Show. So can't say enough good things about that show.
Thank you very much for your answers. We have a couple of more questions, maybe time for. The next one is for the baby boomers who grew up with Amos and Andy. How do you think our identity with humor may have been impacted? Hopefully, those of you who have presented know who Andy and Amos are. Perhaps you're too young to have remembered them. Excuse me.
I know who they are. Actually, my mother was very young when she had me, so I spent time with her grandparents. Maya Angelou has a quote that I really love, and I refer to it a lot. She says, "I did then what I knew how to do. Now that I know better, I do better." When we look at those shows with these eyes, we're looking at with this critical awareness that I have of being a Black woman at this time. When I look at those shows and think about how they impacted me, those men were able to make money and do things in a way that was their time and that was their story. And so this kind of relates to the other question about all the ways that we see young comics now. That was their time, and our time is different, and we have many, many layers. So for me, it's another way that people expressed humor at the time, and that certainly related to that Jim Crow experience. And my time is different. So I'm looking, like we talked about, women comics just is very different. So I don't know if that makes sense, but everything has its place, and that was my grandparents' place and time, and that's their humor. Ta-Nehisi Coates says, he was talking about his son, his black is not my black any more than my father's black is mine. And so their comedy is not my comedy any more than the comedy of my children is my comedy, if that makes sense.
Very good, Stacey. Any other comments about that? If not, maybe we can go to the next question. When does humor become the tool one uses to avoid dealing with the true issue?
I can start with that comment. I think, in my personal opinion, I think humor is the vehicle to help you to deal with the issue. So a lot of times, if you can laugh about it, you can get yourself to the point where you can deal with it. Like, I don't think you should use humor and it's done. That is the mechanism, that vehicle to take you to where you need to go to resolve that issue, to get that help. And so that's what that will be my comment on it. I don't see it as the end all be all with that vehicle.
It's not a tool to avoid the true issue. It's a way of getting through the true issue. Is that what you're saying in part, Lena? Okay. Any other comments?
Yeah, my anecdotal comment on that would just be that, really to Lena's point, like once you can joke about something, like this idea of something being too fresh, right? A wound being, or a trauma being too fresh, most people, can't really necessarily, there's no levity in the situation because you're too close to it. So to Lena's point, I think that you do have, it's powerful once you can get once you removed enough, that you can see the humor in it, and you're outside of that situation a little bit, then it can really be, transformative, because it can connect you to all of the positive physiological effects that Stacey told us about, but then also, okay, I'm laughing about this thing, I might need to go to therapy about this thing, right? To do the other work. So yeah, I see it being a stepping stone, right?
Thank you. Lastly, then, what was the significant position of the Jolly in the pre-Atlantic slave trade? Anyone want to take a stab at that question? Is it clear in terms of what it means?
It's not clear to me. What does that mean, the Jolly?
I'm not acquainted with that either. Is anyone else?
Dr. Bailey, I was hoping you was gonna school us, because I'm like, maybe this need a PhD.
I was actually a little, but I was, again, I would have asked for clarification, because I was thinking, like, is that the same as the Black Dandy? Because I'm familiar with that, because I'm used to I guess I'm not used to Jolly as a
right, me either. So I'm like, okay, maybe this is a PhD level question, because I don't know it.
Well, we appreciate the question. We're pretty obviously not able to respond to it because we're not quite clear about what it is. So with that said, thank you so much for responding to all of the different types of questions that were raised to you today. And I'd like now to turn back to Audrey Lucas, who will do our summary of our meeting today. Audrey?
I just also had a kind of a statement question, just out of curiosity. I don't really watch social media a lot, but sometimes I see that with young people, they have decided to think things are funny at the expense of other people. And I sit in my chair and say, that's not funny. That's really not funny when you're injuring or making other people feel bad, and you think that to other people, that's something to laugh at. Do you think that that's because of the way we live today, or that people feel that they have to be more extreme in how they try to be funny? Because I think that's not a very good path to go down, but that's my own personal opinion.
Actually, I think it's a little bit of both, because when I look at like some of the comedians that we've talked about, they actually were very cruel to their audience. I watched Def Jam. There were certain comedians that would target people. I do think there's this piece where people are super extreme. I think that they're looking for a thrill. So I think it's a little bit of both. And this is one of those places where I don't like being around nasty people. So when people are mean and nasty, I get away. And a couple of these people that have done these pranks on people have gotten their tails beat. I've seen that too. I don't care for it. I don't participate in it, but it is something different about this generation. It's like they're different.
They are a little different. And I really, as I think about it, it seems to me like they've lost the real joy of laughter, of what is funny, of what comforts you, as we're talking about, in how to cope with life through humor. And I'm just hoping that these are not things that will build, but that somehow people will get a better understanding of what humor, true humor is.
Well, I'm going to take it a step further. When I look at some of these people and I see this in the therapy room, it's a disconnect with humanity, right? To be kind, to be considerate, to have manners, to be respectful. There is a large group of the population that does not have that. And I work at the U of M, I work with graduate students, and I have to let them know in the beginning, this is how you talk to me. It's a humanity and a respect. And I think that makes it hard, as I have 3 children, 30, 33, 23, and 21. And my kids will say, oh, my friends, this is a good example. My daughter has a friend that I really like. And when we went over to visit their family, the mother was like, my daughter is so well behaved when you're here. And when we left, I asked my daughter, I said, well, what is that about? She said, I told her, my mother likes you. If you are disrespectful to your parents and you cuss at your mother in front of my mother will never have anything to do with you, and I'll never be over here again. And her mother's like, you can come over anytime. And I was just like, wow, because she's never given me that vibe, because I just don't want to be around that. And I don't like it.
And the one thing I would say real quick to that, there is, I think your observations are correct, Audrey, in terms of like the kind of physically cruel, like there does seem to be a tenor to this more contemporary humor, but to Stacey's point, D.L. Hughley was, I used to, hate to watch his stand up. I had the opportunity to interview him. He was just so intelligent, and I really started to get an appreciation for him, but I used to hate his stand-up because it was a lot of it was at the expense, like many comics, of people in the front row, right? You got the expense of your audience. And so there were so many, and that's still, I feel like, a thing with comedians, right? So many jokes at the expense of the audience that were cruel, but also even in thinking about memes, this is something I've had to think about, like the legal implications, because some of those early memes before we understood the internet and stuff were real people. Like you saw somebody, their expression was just like, and then you took a picture, and then people, and I had to say to folks, what if that was your child, or what was that was your cousin? And you would see even people like responding years later in articles and blogs talking about like, here's how this affected me because I became the whatever girl, or I became, and so thinking about like the cruelty of that you're distributing and mass distributing now, because once nobody knows who created the first whatever meme, that you've disseminated this image of someone's child, someone's sister, someone's wife. And so that is cruel in a different way, but there's hardly any way to kind of hold anyone accountable for that because of the way that, viral things work, right? And so it's sort of an interesting and murky territory, I think, that we find ourselves in when you think about that.
Yeah, Dr. Bailey, I agree. I actually performed a show at D.L. Hughley early in my career, and this comedian literally had this guy walk out, and he paid all this money to see him, and he dogged him so bad. And as a young comedian, my lesson was I will never do that. These people are paying to see me. I want them to leave feeling a really good way. But I will say, Audrey, one of the things I was blessed with, my comedy was not tamed as a young kid. I was a jokester. I was a class clown. A lot of that came out of trying to cope with where I came from. I had really good teachers, though. And my teacher would say, Lena, now it's not the time, but we have a presentation coming up. I want you to take all those jokes and I want to see that in your presentation. So Alina became a comedian because I started writing for those presentations because I knew I had about 5 minutes to perform. But I had really good teachers who helped tame me to say, you know, this is how you direct that humor. And if I said something in the presentation was offensive, they pulled me aside and said, hey, this was not okay. And so early in my career, even though I wasn't a stand-up comedian at the time as that class clown, I had really good teachers who I felt like tamed me to be very careful about what I said and how I joked. So I don't know that all these folks have that influence.
Well, I thank you for addressing some of the thoughts that I've had in the background, because humor is so important. And I try to always look through humorous eyes when I see things, because there's too much joy in the world. And I say to people all the time, because I happen to be a Christian, God gives us this day, and you only get it once. And so when you get it on that first try, you better do the best you can with it by finding all of the joy that you can. And I'm going to just talk a minute about our theme that has been our 2023, because we decided at the beginning to deal with health, healing, and happiness. And these are the kinds of things that I believe that we as human beings are trying to shoot for every day. And so to have as our last series, humor as a coping mechanism in African American culture, it's just been wonderful to explore how it has been used and all of the things that we have been through based on the things that we've had to deal with as a race. And so I just want to say, I believe that this has been an outstanding way to close out our 2023 series as we explored this topic. And it has been wonderful to bring this thought to the front of our brain, too, that we can use humor as a coping mechanism. And we certainly want to thank Dr. Constance Bailey for sharing great information with us today, and for our panelists, Stacey Peterson and Lena Green, for all of their insights and all of the things that they were willing to share with us today. And I want to thank Tom for that historical review, because that was also an eye-opener on historical points that we have come through. And we want to thank all of our participants and to thank all of you for your attendance today, for the support that you give to TAASC. We are grateful for every opportunity that we can share with you and for your ability to respond to us. We're going to take a minute to ask you to please save the date of Saturday, January the 27th of 2024, as we have selected that date to celebrate our annual Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebration. And we're hoping to have some great topics next year. So we want you to look at your calendar and look for when we're giving presentations, because we have an important year in front of us where we're going to be voting. And I hope we can find some humor in that somewhere as opposed to a lot of disappointment. But anyway, it's what we're going to be looking at as we go forward into 2024. And again, I thank you for coming and celebrating this day with us. And I believe, Jason, are we going to have some evaluations that we're going to ask individuals to fill out on how they feel about our program today?
We will. in which participants will receive via email in their inbox communications pertaining to the evaluation. Additionally, I did include the evaluation link in the chat for participants to click on and share their input.
Good, that's wonderful. We're going to ask that you please do that because, like they always say to me when they send me a survey, we want to know how we can make things better. So that's what we're going to be doing. And I want to thank you as we close again for being here with us and attending this program, because we feel that the things that we have discussed through this 2023 period have been important to all of us. And we thank all of you for coming today. Thank you.